have that complete freedom as a writer. There is nothing you can't do if you want to write science fiction. And if there's a topic you want to explore, whether it's far future or near future or something as recent as this morning's headlines, you can go ahead and write about it. And nobody can tell you it can't happen or that it's not a possibility. And it's the freedom that attracts people to science fiction, because it takes a certain amount of imagination to want to read this stuff as well, whereas a lot of people just want simple, straightforward, uncomplicated entertainment, which is fine. But the people who both write and read science fiction want something a little bit more.
Post-apocalyptic. Oftentimes in media we see the term used in every facet of fiction imaginable. TV shows, stories, movies, you get the picture. But why is that? Well, unfortunately, there is no crystal-cut clear answer as to why people write these post-apocalyptic stories the way that they do. But oftentimes, one might speculate that it stems from the long-asked, albeit existential, question of how would a society function with the extinction of mankind? A question with also very little answers. However, this didn't stop writers from across the globe from attempting to answer it through various means with several different interpretations to follow. Prior to contrary belief, one of the very first stories that covered such a complex topic was in 1826's The Last Man, written by Mary Shelley. It was only afterwards, during the landscape of the 1940s, around the same time World War II took place, that the post-apocalyptic scene really started to pick up steam and form into its own genre. The fear of global annihilation due to nuclear weaponry being the primary catalyst. More importantly, however, it gave people a meaningful hypothetical scenario which had the potential to be utilized as a powerful plot tool for storytelling. An author by the name of Sarah Langan once said in an interview, "Before any catastrophe, there are people who see it coming. During, there are heroes who fight against it. And after, there are survivors who try to preserve and build." It was this mentality that Sarah and most likely a lot of other writers shared that allowed them the creative freedom to be able to make stories set in a post-apocalyptic world interesting. But how does one go about writing about a post-apocalyptic world exactly? Well, the answer to that question, like the subject of post-apocalypticism in general, is actually a lot more complex than one might initially think. However, these writing tips that we're about to delve into and explore together will hopefully provide some helpful insight into what makes building these kinds of worlds more interesting. So if you're an avid writer looking to create a post-apocalyptic world of your own, you might want to listen in, because these tips may very well help you with your future writing endeavors. Like any good story, one of the most important aspects of writing one is, well, the story itself. But how does one go about writing a story where most, if not all, of the human population had been wiped out? Well, there are actually a few ways to pull this off, but first we need to understand what post-apocalypticism is. Apocalypse, by definition, refers to the complete destruction of the world, with post meaning after. So it stands to reason that most post-apocalyptic stories take place after the worldwide tragedy had already occurred. With that said, there are stories that delve into why the world was reduced to the state that it was in, as well as the various methods, such as Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11, where a flu pandemic is the cause for humanity being wiped out within the span of a week. Wilson Tucker's The Long Loud Silence covers the story of East Mississippi being destroyed by a nuclear attack, as well as one of the most popular examples being War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, a story about an alien race of Martians invading and conquering Earth and wiping out a solid majority of the population. By the end of this story, it details the slow and gradual decay of humanity, all thanks to the invasion of these otherworldly creatures far beyond human comprehension, other than brief descriptions of their appearances. Now, some may argue that because War of the Worlds in particular has been parodied so many times that it became overused and formulaic. I personally disagree, however. What makes a story subjectively good isn't too often the story itself, although it is the most important factor and can very easily be the sole reason an observer gets drawn in. What keeps them staying, however, has everything to do with the execution. It's the same reason why post-apocalyptic stories or movies like The Colony get heavily criticized for its lack of real cohesion or poor sloppy execution in ideas. Oftentimes, they fall into the category of either trying to put too much into one film or putting too little into areas that need to be explored more. When writing a post-apocalyptic story, It's recommended that you observe other stories of the same or similar premise with careful consideration as to not risk exploring too much or explaining too little. The same applies to any story, but when done so in post-apocalyptic media, it's, needless to say, all the more apparent. This is because post-apocalyptic stories are often regarded as easier to make than most other stories with more lively environmental settings. The more that goes on, the more to expand upon. And why expand upon a world where half of it is already dead? Post-apocalyptic stories by default are under a lot of the same pretense as most stories of similar nature. Wrecked buildings, abandoned desolate streets, deserted cities, as well as areas that were once populated and inhabited by human life. Most if not all post-apocalyptic stories follow that same kind of environmental structure. So some may wonder, if the structure of the environments are so formulaic, then what makes post-apocalyptic stories any different from other genres? Well, one of the things that makes post-apocalyptic stories as interesting as they are is the level of creative freedom and liberties a writer can take. Not only that, but post-apocalypse by its definition is, albeit pretty broad. In writer's terms, meaning it can take place anywhere at any given time period. You could very easily make a story in the modern day and age about a post-apocalyptic story run by a robotic civilization, the same way you could also make a post-apocalyptic story during a time period during a more medieval-like time period with wizards and sorcerers. As a genre, what makes certain writers gravitate towards the post-apocalyptic route is how flexible the genre truly is, as well as how many ways you can tell the story and take it several different directions. It also stands to reason that your post-apocalyptic story can take place at any given time, past, present, and or future. Some stories often combine elements of all three, or often just two. An example of a story that combines the perspective of a person reading a story from the past, written by a person of the past and present time, would be Ted Chiang's Exhalation. It tells the story of a mechanical being from a universe long since perished due to the air pressure in their world slowly equalizing, in a world where air currents power his consciousness. The story ends on a briefly optimistic, almost hopeful note, but it does so in a way that doesn't clash or interfere with the pre-established tone of the story. We've been using that word a lot, haven't we? Tone, clash. What am I going on about? Well, what if I told you that there was another factor when telling a story that is, in some cases, equally as important, if not more so than the story itself? Atmosphere. Now, atmosphere on the surface seems pretty hard to define. A lot of writers consider it something ethereal, or in Layton's terms, hard to digest or describe. However, going by the bare bones definition, atmosphere is simply the pervading tone of a mood or place, situation, or work of art. Most science fiction writers often say that a lot of the best post-apocalyptic stories are pretty much dripping in atmosphere in every possible corner. But what does that truly mean? Well, typically when writers use this terminology, it's often just a fancy glorified way of saying that the atmosphere which the story is portrayed is often unique and distinguished within the world it's trying to establish. Now, if you're just learning about what atmosphere is, you're most likely thinking to yourself, okay, and what does that mean? Now, in case you're wondering this, to elaborate, each story has a specific established tone which a majority of the time it follows throughout the duration of your story. For example, very rarely will you see people experiment with a story that shifts off an incredibly friendly and wholesome environment and tone, only for it to shift to a horrifyingly dark and disturbing tone, and then back to the established tone from the beginning. Needless to say, most of the audience doesn't appreciate this one bit, and more often than not, they'll leave feeling confused and disoriented. When it comes to trying to attract a fresh new audience, it's better to leave your story with as consistent of a tone as possible. Post-apocalyptic stories are often pretty good at this. More often than not, when you read the best kinds of these stories, you leave with a feeling of intrigue and a lot of times empathetic for the situations that the characters in the stories are being put through and have to endure for the narrative's sake. Which, in the case of post-apocalyptic stories especially, is often a pretty morbid situation if you see things from a certain point of view. Most of these stories often follow the premise of the human race as we know it dwindling to a mere handful, as well as how the main character interacts with a world where most of their species, for all they know, is gone. A lot of writers consider it, well, rather isolating, to put it lightly. So in a certain sense, the lack of substance at first sight inadvertently creates more substance, by letting the audience piece together the story themselves. Needless to say, this attracts a lot of attention from readers who are not only avid enjoyers of the science fiction genre, but people who crave more content with these topics and themes. So what you'd want to do is, try and capture that specific atmosphere you have in mind and find a way to capitalize on it. The atmosphere is what draws your audience to the world you create. The most popular stories in fiction in general serve as a testament to that. What makes post-apocalyptic stories in general so engaging is how incredibly effortless it is to establish a tone. Granted, a much darker tone isn't always for everyone, but having half of the layout or setting of your story already set up in advance makes it much easier for writers to focus on the more finer, minute details, which most viewers may or may not miss upon first glance. It's reasons like these why most post-apocalyptic science fiction writers gravitate towards these kinds of worlds, and hopefully you're beginning to see why. To wrap this long-winded tangent up, post-apocalyptic stories are a very fascinating genre left up to a lot of interpretations and speculation. Whether it be the simple answer of how the post-apocalyptic world could be created within the confines of the real world, or answering the question of, if the apocalypse does come, what comes next? I hope people can understand and put these tips to great use with their future endeavors, even if it isn't writing. At the very least, I hope that the people watching learned a bit more about a genre where the people who are passionate about it will only continue to improve their craft until one day they paint a post-apocalyptic world of their very image. Although most likely nobody's wishing for an apocalyptic world in the realm of reality, exploring the concepts within the confines of fiction is a trip I'll willingly be a part of any day. Thanks for watching.